In a world where ideas clash and conflicts rise, Jordan Peterson emerges as the master of intellectual combat, equipping us with the tools needed to defend ourselves in the heat of any argument.
The fact that there are asymmetries has nothing to do with your basic argument.
Peterson's teaching on defending oneself in arguments transcend mere rhetoric and surface-level tactics. Armed with the armor of knowledge, Peterson urges us to engage in rigorous self-examination.
The issue is, what's more dangerous? To regulate it or to leave it be?
Cultivating a deep understanding of our own beliefs and biases. Peterson's wisdom extends beyond mere quest for victory in arguments. He encourages us to listen deeply, to genuinely seek understanding rather than dominance.
So Roger suggested this technique, which I said I would get to the technique. He said, the next time you find yourself embroiled in an argument with someone that's contentious and uncomfortable, say, institute the following rule. You don't get to respond to the person's claims until they've exhausted that particular claim, and this does presume to some degree that you're dealing with a good faith actor, even if they feel differently than you do.
Through Peterson's teachings, we learn that effective argumentation is not about overpowering our opponents with brute force, but about the strategic deployment of reason, evidence, and clarity.
You don't get to respond until you have recapitulated their viewpoint and summarized it in a manner they find acceptable. That's so treacherously sneaky, that rule.
Peterson exhorts us to embrace intellectual humility, recognizing that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing journey. He teaches us an approach to arguments with an open mind, willing to revise our positions in the face of compelling evidence.
It's a one-sided argument because dangerous as free speech is, we don't ever have to deny that there's such a thing as hateful speech or damaging speech or corrosive speech or untruth speech or pathological speech in every possible direction. That isn't the issue.
That's why our society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power. It's not power. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice. You have to demonstrate that you attended to what they say closely enough and carefully enough to, first of all, act out validation of the idea that they have an opinion worth attending to. So that's a big deal, eh? People really like being paid attention to. There's nothing people like more than that, unless they have something to hide. And even then, there's a part of them that would rather have that paid attention to than fail to pass, what would you say, to go unnoticed. Every cynic is entirely disappointed when his or her cynicism goes unchallenged, because there's a part of them, like a little unwarped part of their soul, that's still alive thinking, oh my God, I hope someone calls me on all my foolishness and cynicism, because if they don't, that means that it's valid and generally applicable, and I'm in hell, and what good is that? And I really mean that, And so you're called upon to, first of all, summarize what they said, which is not an easy thing, right? Because it means you have to, and sometimes it's somewhat incoherent and emotion-laden, especially if it's in the course of an argument. So you have to sort of strike right to the quick. It sounds to me like this is the point you were making. And then you lay out the point, and then you see they have to be happy with your summary. They have to be pleased with it, which means that you're doing exactly the opposite of straw-manning the argument, quite the contrary. And you're doing them a favor in some sense by reducing it to the gist, because that's actually an incredibly complex cognitive operation. I had one client who was extraordinarily seriously affected, and in the final analysis, I don't know if I was of any help to her, because the pit of family pathology she was ensconced in was so deep that no matter how far we dug, there was always a new layer of lies underneath the lies we had already worked months to uncover. It was just awful, like homicidal level awful, literally terrible. But she told me she went on a tangent that lasted for 4 consecutive day clinical sessions. Like, they weren't the whole day, but they were 50 minutes on 4 consecutive days. I had no idea where she was going. She was wandering all over in this Freudian associational manner, and she came to the point at the end of it It was unbelievable. She tied together this, she was a very intelligent woman. She tied together this tremendously long, incoherent ramble into a little bow right at the end, like the punchline of a remarkable joke. And she had extracted, in some sense, the gist of what she was saying as a consequence of the circumambulation, the wandering through all this territory. And when you listen to someone very, very carefully, and especially if they express themselves for a while, and you say to them, well, it sounds to me like this is what you're saying, what you're doing is taking a tremendous amount of emotionally laden material, a lot of it unnecessary in the final analysis because of the ensuing synthesis, and offering them a synthesis, which is a great thing to do, especially if they're happy to accept it, because that also means that you did listen to them. So you signified that they were worth attending to, and then you listened to them enough to actually understand what they were saying, to try to understand it, and then you did understand it. And then they're way happier with you, even if you're arguing with them, because at least now they know they can rely on you to be a reliable listener, and that you're not trying to, you know how it is when you're arguing with someone, there's a part of you that really wants to win. It's like, I'm right, you're stupid and wrong. And so the best way for me to demonstrate that is to warp and bend your argument in some, make it trivial in some way it isn't, especially if it's directed to some degree at like elucidating my character flaws and to minimize you in doing so. And if you do that, of course, well, that's not a great road to peace unless you're willing to bring a big club to the argument. I don't believe that this argument has ever been about the rights of transgender people. I think that it's an attempt by the radical left ideologues to push their ideological agenda forward using attempts to manipulate the linguistic domain. And I'm not willing to cede the linguistic domain because I don't think there are anything more important than the words that you use. And then when the government says, well, you should start using these words, you should start thinking hard about your damn government, because your words are no different than your thoughts, and your thoughts orient you in the world. And if someone's going to tell you what it is that you have to think, then they're going to disorient you in the world. And I wouldn't recommend that, because there's lots of terrible things that can happen to you. And if you're disoriented, you're going to run into a very large number of them. If you play fair in every interaction, or if everyone you interact with walks away from your interactions having gained, then everyone is going to line up to play with you. And so how is that going to be anything but good for you? How could anything possibly be better than that? Because you're outnumbered very badly. And so if all the people around you are inclined, because of the way you've conducted yourself, to facilitate your progress forward, why wouldn't that be the best thing for you that could possibly occur? And one of the things I've suggested to my audiences, and people seem to resonate with this quite deeply, is imagine yourself ill and bereft of capacity, suffering. You think, well, what might sustain you during such a time? This is the question that's posed in a marriage, for example, for better or for worse, let's say. And one answer is the fruits of the sacrifices that you offered in relationship to other people previously. And so what does that mean? Well, if you had been responsible and caring, mature, and self-sacrificing in the proper manner, and I don't mean martyrdom, like a nihilistic martyrdom or a resentful martyrdom, then you've stored up, to put it sort of coldly, social capital. And then people will be pleased to return the favor in times of desperation. And that way, if that was the case for all of us all of the time, then we'd be in a mutually sustaining web of interactions. People are called upon to defend fundamental assumptions that were so taken for granted that virtually no one has an argument that's fully articulated at hand. Yeah. When no one questions free speech, no one has to defend it thoroughly. As soon as it's questioned, well, it becomes an extraordinarily complicated problem. The same with gender identity. When it's
when no one's paying attention to it, it's obvious. But as soon as you have to think it through, it becomes a rat's nest, to say the least. When I was in the UK a few years ago, I saw a number of things that I felt were disturbing. People seem to have accepted the omnipresence of CCTV cameras to a degree that I found horrifying, frankly. I don't like CCTV cameras. I don't like the message they portray, which is that everyone is criminal enough so they should be surveyed all the time and someone needs to be watching. I noticed too in London in particular that many buildings had instituted airport level security so that you had to pass through a metal detector and have your bags checked, etc., while you were moving in and out of buildings. And it struck me as quite horrifying, given that, as far as I'm concerned, Great Britain and its legal and parliamentary traditions are at the epicenter of Western freedoms. I mean, you could make a case for France, I suppose, but not a strong one as far as I'm concerned. Yet, your citizens seem to have accepted this with virtually no problem. And now, on the heels of that, we have this multiplication of hate crime. And so what you do when you go to university is you learn to say what you think as clearly as you can, and to take the slings and arrows that come along with that. Not in an arrogant manner, right? Because like, what the hell do you know? You know, so you've got plenty to learn, but you want to formulate your thoughts carefully. You want to write what you think. Well, why? Because when you're writing, you're thinking. You're laying out the arguments that you're going to use to structure your existence in the world throughout your entire life. And if you start to twist and bend those for expedient reasons, you're going to warp your soul. And I mean, I could talk about that neurophysiologically if you want to. You know, you become what you practice. You automate what you practice. So if you automate expedient speech for the sake of short-term gain, then that's what you're going to produce. You're going to produce expedient speech for short-term gain. Well, God help you if you do that. Like, there is nothing that you will possibly do in your entire life that will serve you better than to get control of your voice in university. And so you do that by reading, right? You read great people. You do that by writing what you think. You stay true to yourself while you write what you think, and you take the risks and you gain the benefits that go along with that. You learn to stand up and speak and to listen carefully. And that makes you a negotiator of unparalleled power. And if you're a negotiator of unparalleled power, there's nothing in the world that won't open itself up to you. So that's what you're doing in university. And if you find professors who reject that, and there's fewer of them than you might think, then it's your sacred obligation to stand up for yourself against that. Because it's going to happen to you throughout your whole life, and you might as well start practicing how to do it right now. So that's how it looks to me. So anyways, and then, you know, Dostoevsky pursued the idea of nihilism even farther, because Dostoevsky was certainly someone who was willing to go to the ends of an argument. And one of the things he proclaimed was that if there was no God, then anything was permitted. And his basic hypothesis was, well, if there's no ultimate arbiter of values, if there's no transcendent arbiter of values, then you're radically free. Now, you know, the existentialists would say, well, you could use that radical freedom to find meaning in your life. But one of the things Dostoevsky realized was that you could use that radical freedom for anything that you wanted. And so in his book, Crime and Punishment, for example, he explores the actions and beliefs of a student named Raskolnikov. And Raskolnikov is a starving student. He's a law student, and he doesn't have enough to eat. So, of course, his cognition is a little bit on the addled side because he's going through periods of starvation and drunkenness. So it's not like he's thinking that clearly. He wants to become a law student so that he can help society. And he finds out that his sister is basically willing to enter into a loveless marriage and more or less prostitute herself so that she can generate enough money to share with her mother so that they can fund his continuation through law school. And he thinks that wouldn't be a very good deal. At the same time, he's indebted to a pawnbroker who everyone hates, who's an absolutely miserable person in every possible way. And Dostoevsky sets up the situation like that. So the pawnbroker
has a niece, if I remember correctly, who she basically enslaves and mistreats, and she squirrels away all sorts of money but never does anything with it, lives in absolute poverty. And anyways, he considers her the sort of person without whom the world would be a better place. So having all of these things co-occurring in his imagination, he decides that because there are no ultimate arbiters of value, that all morality is essentially cowardice.
In the realm of self-improvement, Jordan Peterson emerges as a guiding light, revealing the simple yet profound truth that to navigate the complex tapestry of life, one must embody both danger and discipline.
To transform your personality, that first of all you had to be disciplined, that's for sure.
Peterson's voice resounds with urgency as he expounds upon the necessity of embracing our inner power, acknowledging that a life devoid of danger leads to stagnation and unfulfilled potential. However, Peterson's wisdom comes with a crucial caveat, a call for discipline.
Because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you.
He elucidates that it's not enough to simply plunge into chaos without restraint. Peterson's teachings unveil the intricate dance between danger and discipline, showing us that to be dangerous without discipline is to court chaos and self-destruction, while discipline without danger leads to a life of mediocrity and unfilled potential.
I would say it's temperamental. You know, people differ tremendously in their temperaments, and to think that there's a warrior temperament is a perfectly reasonable thing to think. I mean, there's been whole cultures, many cultures, who are devoted to fostering that warrior mentality, you know, where if you weren't like that, you were the outlier.
With every word, Peterson imparts the importance of cultivating both mental and physical toughness. He underscores the significance of developing resilience, perseverance, and unwavering commitment to adversity head-on.
The problem with political narratives, in my estimation, is that they can rapidly transform themselves into ideologies. And ideologies are dangerous for a variety of reasons, but the primary reason for their danger, I think, this is a hypothesis, is because of their one-sided nature. What happens is that they capitalize, parasitize.
The nexus of danger and discipline becomes the crucible in which character is forged. Peterson urges us to harness our inner strength, to transcend our limitations, and to push the boundaries of what we thought was even possible.
Harry Potter's little team aren't the delinquents, right, who have no discipline, but they're also not the good kids. They're the kids who will break rules when necessary, and that's the issue. Break rules when necessary. Now, the question is, when is that necessary? Well, that's sort of the ultimate ethical choice.
People have a great capacity for evil, and I didn't really understand that of myself until the early 80s, something like that, after meditating on it for a long time.
You have to pass through a disciplinary structure before, and even in principle, you could be free. Before you're disciplined, you're not free, you're just chaotic. And so you have to practice some set of routines and rituals. Now, you could say, well, they don't necessarily have to be religious, and they could be secular. You could become a lawyer, you could become a plumber, you could become a carpenter, and I would say yes.
I would never claim to be good. I think it's dangerous. But I did become terrified of how terrible I could be. And I mean, I became terrified about how terrible human beings could be, and that's one thing, but that's easy. It's easy to confuse that with other human beings.
That's a very interesting thing, because then it's not merely a matter of following a set of arbitrary rules. It's following a set of rules that have a clear path to success, right? That's a very different thing, and that's also something that's honest, because the rules of the game are well established, and then if you play it properly, you get to win. And that's a big deal as well. You know, and you mentioned the SEAL types, and I've met a number of people like that. You know, they're capable of breaking rules, let's say, or maybe even inclined to break them. But I also think that this is part of the reason that I'm an admirer of Carl Jung, because Jung makes it very clear that, see, he was very interested in the barriers to enlightenment. Because if there's such a thing as being enlightened, let's say, then why isn't everyone enlightened? If it's just a matter of taking the glorious route and following your bliss, let's say, it's like, well, that sounds pretty easy. Why isn't everyone enlightened? But Jung's thinking isn't like that at all. He believed that in order to transform your personality, that first of all, you had to be disciplined, that's for sure. But you also had to integrate that part of you that was terrible and capable of breaking rules and make it part of you. And so then, and I really like that idea. Well, here's an example. So about 20 years ago, I would say, there was a newspaper headline in one of Canada's major newspapers, and it was the Minister of Foreign Affairs at that time, Lloyd Axworthy, and he was talking about what had happened with Milosevic in the former Soviet Union in Yugoslavia and the atrocities that were being committed. And he said that he was caught unawares by that because he didn't have the imagination for that kind of evil. And I thought, well, you think that what you're doing is signaling your virtue by making a statement like that. But from my perspective, all you're doing is stating your cowardice and your historical ignorance, because if you're going to be Minister of Foreign Affairs, you bloody well better have imagination for that kind of evil.
It's an idea that's expressed, for example, in the classic Disney movie, which I really like, called Pinocchio. And when Pinocchio is attempting to free himself from the forces that manipulate him as a puppet and to become an autonomous being, he is required to go to the darkest place to find the worst monster and face that voluntarily. And in doing so, he rescues his father. And that's a very old idea. I don't know how old it is. It's one of the oldest ideas we have in written form, and there's no doubt that in its pre-written form it would be tens of thousands of years older than that. And it's a very strange idea that you have to journey to the darkest abyss to free the spirit of your father. But there's a reason for it, and it has to do with the tragic view of life, which is that you can't discover what you're capable of being or withstanding, and those are the same things, if you hide away from any of the things about life that are terrible but true. And the reason you can't discover who you are without doing that is that only necessity will force that out of you. I mean that from the perspective of learning. If you go work in a palliative care ward, you'll learn to deal with death. You'll learn the psychological strategies necessary, the steps. You'll become more informed. But it's deeper than that even. We know now from a biological perspective that if you put yourself in new situations, in new and challenging situations, that new genes turn on in your nervous system and code for new proteins that produce new neurological structures.
Because if you don't, then anyone who does wins. They beat you. And so again, in the Harry Potter stories, you see he's touched by evil, right? He actually has a soul fragment that's embedded within him that's as black as anything can possibly be. That's why he could talk to snakes. But without that, he wouldn't be able to have any victory. And that's exactly right psychologically. Unless you can think the way that an evil person thinks, then you're defenseless against them, because they'll go places you can't imagine and then they win. And so the best men I've met, it was interesting even when I was in junior high and high school, because most of my friends dropped out, by the time they were grade 10, thereabouts. And a lot of them were guys who developed physically. They're pretty powerful, and they were just damn sick of putting up their hand to go to the bathroom. It was like, they're not doing that anymore. One of my friends got kicked out when he sort of challenged the gym teacher, physically. And the gym teacher, he could do an iron cross. He was a tough guy, and so it was no trivial matter for my friend to stand up to him, but he got expelled anyways. But, I noticed that it was often the kids whose character I admired that either quit or got expelled, and they were the tougher guys who were just sick and tired of following rules that didn't take into account their character, and then they'd go off and work in the oil rigs or whatever, and you could do that in Alberta at that time. And that was really hard work, So it wasn't like they were necessarily taking the easy path. But A harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very, very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control.
And so Zazu, the eyes of the king, comes to check out the king, and that's, what's his name? What's the king's name? Mufasa, yeah, and he's a very regal-looking person, lion, and he stands up straight and tall, and that means that he's high in serotonin, because serotonin governs postural flexion, and if you're dominant and near the top of hierarchies, you tend to expand so that you look bigger than you could if you shrunk down. And so if you're a low dominant person, you wander around like this so that you look small and weak, and you don't pose a threat to anybody. But if you're at the top, you expand yourself so that you can command the space, and that's why he has that particular kind of regal posture. And if you look at his facial expression, you see that it's quite severe. He's capable of kindness, but he's also harsh and judgmental, and that's what society is like. That's what the superego is like, and what that means is that he's integrated his aggression. And I've seen this happen in my clinical clients when they come in and they're too agreeable. They look like Simba looks later in the movie when he's an adolescent, and he's sort of like a deer in the headlights. Everything is coming in and nothing is coming out. But when the person integrates their shadow and gets the aggressive part of themselves integrated into their personality, their faces harden. And if you look at people, you can tell, because the people who are too agreeable look childlike and innocent, and the people who, well, a hyper-aggressive person will look, mean and cruel. But let's see if that's good. That's still working. So, but I've seen people's face change in the course of therapy, men and women. So, and what happens is they start to look more mature, and it's more like they're judging the world as well as interacting with it properly once they integrate that more disagreeable part of them. It's very, very necessary, and that's part of the incorporation of the Jungian shadow, or the incorporation of the unconscious from a Freudian perspective. But old Musafa there, he's already got that covered.
You can't even be what you are fully biologically unless you expose yourself to everything that you can expose yourself to as you journey through life. The old idea of a pilgrimage was predicated on that idea, as is walking the in Chartres Cathedral, the labyrinth. The idea that you walk the labyrinth in Chartres and you come to the center is that you traverse every corner of the world, quarter by quarter, and then you come to the center. And the center is the center of the church, and it's the center of the crucifixion, it's the center of suffering. And you can't get to what that center signifies without having journeyed everywhere. And so the tragic view of life is necessary because it puts you on the journey that reveals to yourself who you could be if you were courageous as you could be and as truthful as you could be. And that's equivalent to discovering, to revivifying your dead father, because you are an ancient creature in some sense, and perhaps one with a spark of divinity inherent in it. But you will never release that unless you're willing to go everywhere that you have to go, because only necessity will call that out of you. And so you can't be happy, you can't be complete you can't know what you could withstand. You can't have any proper sense of self-respect unless you know what you can tolerate. And if you avoid everything that you have reason to avoid, but should nonetheless not avoid, you won't know who you are, and then you can't live properly.
Obviously, he can smile, and he's capable of the full range of expressions, but he's a tough-looking character. And now, the baboon here, who's supposed to be basically just a fool when the story was first written, he turned into what's essentially a shaman across time. And
So he represents the self from the Jungian perspective. Now the self is everything you could be across time. So imagine that there's you and there's the potential inside you, whatever that is, you know. And potential is an interesting idea because it represents something that isn't yet real, yet we act like it's real. Because people will say to you, you should live up to your potential. And that potential is partly what you could be if you interacted with the world in a manner that would gain you the most information. Right? Because you build yourself out of the information in the Piagetian sense. But it's deeper than that too, because we know that if you take yourself and you put yourself in a new environment, new genes turn on in your nervous system. They encode for new proteins. And so you're full of biological potential that won't be realized unless you move yourself around in the world into different challenging circumstances, and that'll turn on different circuits. So it's not merely that you're incorporating information from the outside world in the constructivist sense. It's that by exposing yourself to different environments, you put different physiological demands on yourself all the way down to the genetic level, and that manifests new elements of you. And so one of the things that happens to people, and this is a very common cultural notion, is that you should go on a pilgrimage at some point to somewhere central, and that would be, say, like the Rock in the Pride Rock in The Lion King, because you take yourself out of your dopey little village, and that's just the little bounded you that everyone knows and that isn't very expanded, and then you go somewhere dark and dangerous to the central place, and while you do that, you have adventures and they toughen you and pull more out of you, like partly because you're becoming informed, which means information. It means you're becoming more organized at every level of analysis. They're the structure within which philosophy itself is embedded, and outside of that is a behavioral structure. We've talked about how those evolve. You know, there's a behavioral evolution of something approximating a consensual morality, and then stories about that consensual morality emerge, and then inside that the structures of philosophy nest, and all of those things have to be addressed by your identity to some degree, or you're weak. That's the problem. You're beset by doubts, you're beset by anxiety, you're easy to stop, and you don't have much motivation, and none of that's good. It's not good at all, because life presents you with enough real obstacles in the face of genuine suffering, so that unless you're strongly grounded and have a real reason for moving forward, you're going to get stopped, and as soon as you're stopped, you are one miserable thing, because it's almost like the definition of human misery is to be paralyzed by anxiety and emotional pain, and also have no motive force forward. It's a terrible state. And so you don't want to be in that state, and you have to have an identity that's powerful enough and deeply rooted enough so the most profound doubts that might emerge about your life are met by something of equivalent force.
In the crucible of life's challenges, where the weak crumble under the weight of adversity, Jordan Peterson emerges as a beacon of unwavering strength and resilience.
We all have different temperaments, okay? There's 5 dimensions of temperament.
With profound wisdom and piercing insight, Peterson reveals the secrets to building an impenetrable fortress of mental toughness.
Those who rated themselves high on happy would also rate themselves high on social, and those who rated themselves low on happy would also rate themselves low on social.
Drawing upon his extensive expertise in psychology and his own personal battles, Peterson unveils the transformative power of embracing one's suffering and confronting the dragons that lurk within.
That's kind of maternal compassion and empathy versus a kind of tough, more individualized
decisiveness.
Yeah, good. Conscientiousness, that's dutifulness, industriousness and orderliness. Openness, that's creativity and interest in ideas. 5 dimensions.
With every word that he speaks, Peterson dismantles the illusions of entitlement and victimhood, urging us to take responsibility for our lives and embrace the challenges that lie before us.
By looking at those patterns of covariation, you can determine what the essential dimensions are of human personality. One of the dimensions is, roughly, happiness. That's extroversion. Another dimension is neuroticism. It's a negative emotion dimension.
Peterson's teaching transcend mere positive thinking and superficial motivation. He delves into the depths of the human psyche, unraveling the intricate threads that weave together mental toughness.
It seems to me that it's fundamental danger. The fundamental danger is the devaluation of of the sacredness of the individual as the primary category. You replace that by group identity.
Through his profound insights, Peterson reveals that mental toughness is not a trait reserved for the select few, but a skill that can be cultivated through discipline and self-reflection.
If you're still unhappy, you should probably go see someone because you're probably sick. You know, if you've got all of those, if you have all that skill and you have all those relationships and activities in place and you still are suffering an excess of anxiety and pain and insufficient hope and motivation. There's another dimension called agreeableness. And agreeable people are self-sacrificing, compassionate, and polite. If you're dealing with an agreeable person, they don't like conflict. They care for other people. If you're dealing with an agreeable person, they're likely to put your concerns ahead of theirs. They're non-competitive and cooperative. It's a dimension where women score more highly than men on agreeableness across cultures, including those cultures where the largest steps have been taken towards producing an egalitarian social circumstance, like Scandinavia. Actually, the gender differences in personality there are larger than they are anywhere else. Another trait is conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is an excellent trait if you want to do well in school and in work, especially if you're a manager and administrator. I can't say we understand a lot about conscientiousness, although it reliably emerges from factor analytic studies of adjective groups across different countries. Conscientious people are diligent, industrious, and orderly. Their orderliness tilts them towards political conservatism, by the way, because it turns out that your inbuilt temperament, your inbuilt personality, which constitutes a set of filters through which you view the world, also alters the manner in which you process information and influences the way that you vote. And so you might say, and I do believe that this is true, we've been doing a lot of research on this as of late, the more accurate a measure you take of someone's political beliefs, the more you find that personality is what's predicting them. And I think that's a reasonable thing to think about, because, you know, you have to figure out ways of simplifying the world, right? Because you just can't do everything. No matter where you land in the temperamental landscape, you're going to have your associated faults and temptations. And you're going to have your associated proclivity to your particular form of mental illness. So now, that might visit you if you're particularly unlucky, or you might fall into that if you're incautious. But you generally don't get an advantage without an attendant disadvantage. So that's on the genetic front, and then there's environmental variability, for sure. You can take a neurotic child, the studies have already been done on this, so some children by, let's say 2, although you can actually measure this by 6 months. So imagine you have a child in a room, lab, and his or her mother is there, and the mother is sitting and the child's here, and then a little wheeled robot is remote controlled in by the experimenter. Well, some kids will just run right over and engage with the robot, and other kids will hide behind their mother and then sort of peek out. And the ones who hide are higher in negative emotion. And then if it's a baby-eating robot, they're not dead, so that's their strategy. Whereas you know, hey, your kids are going to go play with a strange dog at the playground, you know, or not. And sometimes that's real fun, and sometimes it's no fun at all. And sometimes it's the, you know, kid who's hiding behind his mother's legs that doesn't have his face torn off by the pit bull. So there's variability for a reason, you know, and then the more neurosis prone, the more kids more prone to negative emotion, they're going to suffer from a higher proclivity for depression and anxiety later in their life, and that's the price they pay for their threat sensitivity. But if you take those kids and you really encourage them to explore voluntarily instead of facilitating their proclivity to hide themselves, you can tilt them up into the normal range for negative emotion. If you're introverted, you're going to spend much more time on your own. And so if you're an introverted person, for example, you're going to want a job where you're not selling and where you're not surrounded by groups of people who are making social demands on you all the time because it'll wear you out. Whereas if you're extroverted, that's just exactly what you want. And so the extrovert sees the world as a place of social opportunity, and the introvert sees the world as a place to retreat from and spend time alone. And it turns out that both of those modes of being are valid. The issue, at least to some degree, is whether or not you're fortunate enough to match your temperament with the demands of the environment, and I suppose also whether you're fortunate enough so that you're born in an era where there actually is a niche for your particular temperament, because it isn't necessarily the case that that will be the case. Imagine that all of these temperamental dimensions vary because of evolutionary pressure, right? So there's a distribution of extroversion, a normal distribution. Most people are somewhere in the middle, and then as you go out towards the extremes, there are fewer and fewer people. And what that means is that on average, across large spans of time, there have been environments that match every single position on that distribution, with most of the environments matching the center, because otherwise we wouldn't have evolved that way. And so sometimes being really extroverted is going to work well for you in a minority of environments, a minority of niches, and sometimes it's just going to be a catastrophe. I suspect, for example, that if you live in a tyrannical society where any sign of personally oriented activity is likely to get you in trouble, that being extroverted and low in neuroticism wouldn't be a very good idea, because you're going to be mouthy and happy and saying a lot of things, unable to keep your thoughts to yourself, and you're going to be relatively fearless. Now, I don't know that for sure, because we haven't done the studies that precisely match temperamental proclivity to environmental demand, but you get what I mean.
Try to listen to what you say, to what you're saying, and see if it makes you feel stronger or weaker.
Yeah.
Like each word is like a stepping stone through a swamp.
Right.
You know, and if it's the right word, then you step on it and it feels secure and stable compared to the territory around it, and you test that out, and then you dare to see if that's the way you think, as opposed to that persona that you're putting on for public adulation and protection, right? That's the temptation of the actor. So in the movie Pinocchio, when Pinocchio is trying to stop lying and to become a real boy, he faces two major temptations apart from lying. One is to be a victim, and the other is to be an actor. It took me a long time to figure out why being an actor was a temptation, but you put your finger on it with your description. It's to adopt a set of roles that will, well, appeal to narcissistic inflation, something like that. It's right. And there's a terrible totalitarian danger in that. It's terrible.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And that's, my suspicions are that's what you were reacting to so viscerally, that you were participating in that, and you had your reasons. But you mentioned something that I think maybe the three of us could discuss that would be interesting. You know, this idea about all white people being racist. So I kind of wondered about that as a psychologist, but more broadly, because maybe you could say, well, are all people racist?
You're never going to take a kid who's really high in trait neuroticism and make them as low in trait neuroticism as someone, you know, at the 99.9th percentile genetically. You just can't. And maybe you could do it if you did nothing else than train that child like 12 hours a day for 10 years. But you can shift people a fair bit. And if you're introverted, you can learn extroverted skills. And if you're agreeable, you can learn to stand up for yourself. And if you're unconscientious, you can learn to discipline yourself, although that's a tricky one, because you usually don't have the discipline to discipline yourself if you're unconscientious. So, and then in terms of habit, well, you become what you practice. And so if you're high in neuroticism, it's going to take a lot of practice to get you all calmed down. But that's what you do in psychotherapy with people all the time, because a large number of people who are in therapy have higher than average levels of negative emotion, and you help them become stronger. And the way you do that is by strategizing with them and encouraging them to confront the things that they're afraid of and avoiding, and they become more able and more courageous as a consequence of doing so, and you can shift people quite a lot doing that. And that's what you do when you learn, and that's how you teach kids, and it's the universal mechanism of adaptation, and you try to speed that up in psychotherapy, and you can do that for yourself, like this is a really useful.
We all have an in-group preference. Now, what that group might be, it might be you and the person you love, it might be you and your family, it might be you and your town, it might be you and your state or your country, it might be you and your race. That who that in-group is can vary, but we do have preferences for people, and we do have in-group preferences, and the corollary of that is that we have out-group skepticism and maybe fear and maybe disgust and all of that. And from what I've been able to understand anthropologically, that's more or less a human universal. As different peoples have been brought around the world into global community, let's say, one of the things that anthropologists have found is that it's almost always the case that any given tribe of people will use the word that refers to human beings to their tribe and some other word to everyone else. And so it's possible that that's a deep tendency that we all have to fight against. And I mean, there's part of the reason these ideas are so compelling to people and able to possess them, the wokeness ideas, let's say, to use a casual category, is that they contain an element of truth. People have an in-group preference that can easily be distorted into something that's quite akin to racism. I mean, you even see that in chimpanzees, for example. They'll go on raiding forays into neighboring territories, and if they outnumber, the males do this, if they outnumber the foreigners that they come across, they will tear them to pieces. So it's, that was a stunning discovery. Lovely that primatologists made. Jane Goodall's team discovered that in the 70s. It was a real shock.
Wow.
Well, we have the human rights commissions in Canada, which are a quasi-judicial entity with increasing power. And that's a perfect weapon for any activist who's motivated to use it. And that whoever the target of the Human Rights Commission is, you can kiss 5 years of their life goodbye, and there's a high probability that they're going to be found guilty regardless of what they did. It's really, it's truly appalling, especially given that it's happening under the aegis, hypothetically, of human rights.